I think the first thing, and maybe it's just really like 101, but that's where I was at the beginning of this project, is just that regenerative practices like cover cropping or minimum tillage or using more perennials, agroforestry, all of these have deep roots in indigenous communities and communities of color. And it's really important to acknowledge that these aren't brand new ideas, that these in fact are ideas that have been utilized in those contexts for a long time. And on top of that, that they have been part of resistance against an extractive agriculture, against colonialism, and that these indigenous communities and communities of color have been on the front lines of an extractive industrial agriculture for a really long time, way longer than people like me started getting concerned about the climate change impacts or the ecological impacts of that type of agriculture. And so acknowledging that, I think, is another important part of sort of giving credit where credit is due. And then in terms of moving forward, I think those acknowledgements are really helpful in understanding what the leverage points are and really moving towards a regenerative agriculture, that it is really it is a matter of social justice as much as it's a matter of trying to change the techniques that are used in agriculture. It's also a matter of shifting power, because I think the hopeful part to me is that it does seem to me that a majority of the world's people want a food system that is regenerative and reciprocal, and that whenever people have the ability to remain in a place without being disrupted by these kinds of, racist and colonial processes, they want to take care of that place. They imagine that their grandchildren will live in that place, or their nieces and nephews, or, maybe 7 generations into the future, and they want to plant a tree that those future generations will enjoy. And so it's a matter of shifting power, because if we have a democratic society, it is in fact what people want, is to have regenerative food systems and regenerative economies more broadly.
Regenerative farming and gardening isn't new. In fact, it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and we have a lot to learn from our global indigenous communities. In Liz Carlisle's newest book, Healing Grounds, she shares stories of women who are reclaiming their traditions and sharing their stories so that we can learn how practices like no-till, cover cropping, working with native plants, and building community have been part of their heritage and have been part of their culture. And that these practices are something that are rooted in the history of how humans have worked with earth, worked with soil, worked with land, and worked with community. And it really connects us to a reciprocal way of being rather than an extractive model where we're just taking from the earth. Liz is an assistant professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She's an author and an agroecologist and a pretty awesome human. You'll see she's got a lot of heart, and I can't wait to share this conversation with you as she connects us with how we can show up in the regenerative farming, gardening, and living space, both for ourselves and for our community, and with open hearts to learn from each other and to bridge conversations and to bridge learnings instead of trying to one-up each other. Because truly, being in a regenerative space is about working together and building community. I'm Natalie Forstbauer. Thank you so much for joining us and liking these videos, sharing them with your friends, and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us amplify the conversation about planetary health, global regeneration, and being in community with each other. If you haven't subscribed to the magazine yet, hop on over to heartandsoulmagazine.com, where you can grab your very own subscription and be part of our community. You make yourself an amazing day and enjoy this conversation with Liz Carlisle, author of Healing Grounds. Liz, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Natalie. Great to be in conversation.
Yeah, I just love your work. I love the curiosity that you are bringing to the question around regeneration and around its connection to how we work with the land and how we work with not just our current understanding of the way we've been farming and gardening for the last number of decades or 100 years or so, but really going back into our roots and really being present with what your book talks about in Healing Grounds of what that looks like going generations and generations and generations back. So I'm curious, though, what is it that you most want people to understand about your work and writing in Healing Grounds?
Well, I most hope that people have a little bit of the experience that I did in speaking with this group of extraordinary women who are all leaders in regenerative agriculture. When I speak with these women, Latrice Tatsi, Olivia Watkins, Aide Guzman, Nikiko Masumoto, Kumua, I feel so inspired and hopeful about the future. And I also feel this sense that healing really brings together a lot of social concerns that I'm really invested in, and also a lot of ecological concerns that I'm really invested in. And so the work of responding to climate change and the work of racial justice and social justice, in listening to these women, I see how they're so interconnected. And it gives me so much joy and so much kind of forward moving energy to see that there's this beautiful synergy in this work of repair.
So tell me more about that, because what I'm really curious about is the way, like, how do we bridge conversations and how do we learn from each other and it's not just in the general regenerative agriculture scope of organic and biodynamic and regenerative organic agriculture. It's also looking into some of the work they've done with these women, and I'm curious, how do we really show up for each other and learn from each other and what we're doing well, instead of looking at what we might be doing better than the other person?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think for me, it kind of gets to, as I was looking at, the history of agriculture on the North American continent over the past 500 years, and the seeds of all of these regenerative ways of being with the land and indigenous communities and communities of color, and then the struggle between those ways of being that are reciprocal and these extractive ways of being that are part and parcel of colonial processes. I think a really important piece of that extractive mode of agriculture is hierarchy, which is, I think, what you're getting at with that question about how do we move away from thinking about who's better than whom, or whose agriculture is better than whose, or some kind of a dualism between something that's seen as like modern and innovative and something that's seen as backward looking. And I really, a concept that came up again and again as people were describing these ancestral regenerative traditions from North America, from the African continent, from other parts of the Americas, from the Asian continent, was this notion of reciprocity, and this notion that land and people and plants and animals ultimately are so interconnected that the idea of winners and losers starts to not feel relevant if what you're interested in is ecological well-being for the long term. That essentially there's no possibility of a winners and losers that doesn't ultimately undermine the foundation of life for us all. And so then the objective becomes, how do we live well together on this planet, as opposed to how do I dominate this land or this people? And that what I saw again and again in looking at the history is that when agriculture is designed as domination, it always involves domination of both land and people, that extraction from soil and that extraction from people, they go hand in hand. And by the same token, that the reciprocity goes hand in hand in terms of, if we really want to move towards being reciprocal with our land and healing the climate cycle, we also have to figure out how to do that in our society.
That's really powerful. And so how do we move towards that reciprocity as a regenerative farming and gardening movement?
I think there's a lot of pieces, and everybody kind of has their own, role in this grand drama, I guess, depending on where you're positioned. Um, and I think, one kind of fact at the heart of this whole project, again, as I was seeing, like, wow, there's really deep regenerative traditions in the indigenous American community, in the African American community, in the Mesoamerican community, the Latinx community, the Asian American community. And yet all those communities taken together only have title to 2% of agricultural land in the United States. I don't know the figures for the rest of North America, but it's of course part of a similar historical process. And so
Mhm.
one really important part of showing up for each other is acknowledging that this inequity exists and that this legacy of structural racism is really limiting a lot of people who do carry these ancestral ways of regeneration. And so for myself as a white woman, one of the ways that I need to show up and support people is to raise this and to think about how do we move towards land justice? Because without that, we're really not talking about anything that can be done sort of equitably and reciprocally and as this sort of team. Things are very uneven right now in terms of people's access, not only to these practices with land, but to the foods, the health-giving foods, the health-giving medicines
Mhm.
that are part of a regenerative farming system.
Mhm. And what is working well right now?
Well, that honestly is the biggest focus of the book is the stories of these, four extraordinary women in particular that I focus on who are already doing this incredible regenerative work. So Latrice Tatsey, who's a member of Blackfeet Nation in Northwest Montana, is really active in the bison restoration movement, bringing these native herbivores back to her people's homelands. And also her family raises cattle. And she just finished a master's degree at Montana State University, looking at both bison grazing and cattle grazing, how cattle grazing can learn from the way that bison move across a landscape, and what all that has to do with soil health and soil ecology, and ultimately climate change and a response to climate change in restoring prairie. So incredibly inspiring work, really, really impactful work. And then I spoke with Olivia Watkins, who inherited a piece of forested land in North Carolina that's been in her family since 1890. Her great uncle who bought the land was one of the first Black landowners in the area. And for her family, it represented this place of refuge in the face of, white terrorism in the early 20th century. It was a place where they felt relatively safe. And Olivia now has taken on this land in a context where the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill triangle area of North Carolina is rapidly urbanizing. And so these kinds of patches of diverse forest are actually increasingly rare. And so for the wildlife and also the soil microbes that live there, this place is now a place of refuge, a place of sanctuary. And so she's been growing mushrooms, and she's experimented with raising bees in the understory of this forest as a way of, forest farming, agroforestry to continue to provide this place of refuge, both for a Black family, for Black landowners, the Black community, but also for wildlife and soil microbes. And so in both of those cases, we're talking about these really powerful visions of restoring forest and restoring prairie and building food systems that are in synergy with those ecological systems. And then I have to say, I was also incredibly impressed with Ide Guzman, who is, like Olivia and Latrice, also a soil ecologist. And she's really interested in the diversity of soil microorganisms and how that corresponds to diversity of crops, diversity above ground. And she comes from this really interesting background. She was raised in California's Central Valley. Her parents were farm workers, but they had immigrated from a small diversified family farm in Mexico. And, the Green Revolution dynamics and NAFTA had really undermined the ability of families like hers to earn a living on those farms. But they wanted to hang on to it so badly that members of her family were immigrating to the United States and remitting money to make that possible for the family to still hang on to this farm. So she went and got to see that family farm when she was 9. And it inspired her to become an agroecologist and to study what the impact is on the soil and on the ecosystem more broadly when you have these more diversified crops. And in her dissertation, she actually worked with a bunch of immigrant farmers in the Central Valley, some folks from Mexico and Central America, like her family, some from Southeast Asia. And she found that that diversity above ground with all of these different crops, some of them cultural foods, was really boosting the diversity below ground. She found 2 times as many types of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which has huge implications for sequestration of carbon and all these ecosystem processes that are central to regenerative agriculture. So incredible work, and also, uplifting all of these small farmers that most of whom had not ever talked to a researcher before, were kind of, off the map as far as what they're doing ecologically in the Central Valley. And then, just a few miles down the road from where Ide was born, Nikiko Masumoto is farming organic peaches and nectarines and raisin grapes. She's the 3rd generation in her family on this farm. Her dad was the one who converted it to organic. And her family story is really remarkable because her great-grandparents immigrated from Japan, but were never able to own the land they farmed because of alien land laws, these racist laws that prevented Asian farmers from owning land and eventually from even managing it or having any kind of formal relationship to it in farming. And then in World War II, Japanese Americans were interned, incarcerated just for their ethnicity, essentially. And so her grandparents lost everything. But they decided when they got out of that incarceration that they were going to go and plant roots and claim a place of belonging in this soil, even kind of against all odds and with these really racist messages that they had absorbed their entire lives. And so there's a real power in that generational connection in that family around claiming a place of belonging as Asian Americans, really against this history of racism in California, and also reconnecting with these incredible traditions of Asian American regenerative farming that were the basis in many ways of the organic movement. If you look at, Sir Albert Howard's work, he was learning from peasant farmers in India, or Franklin Hiram King's work, he was learning from his travels in Korea and Japan. And so, those stories of those women really, really inspire me to realize they're tapping into these hundreds, 1,000-year histories in their communities of regeneration. And they're also utilizing those modalities of regeneration to really push back against injustice and to really fight against this kind of extractive method of agriculture from both a social and an ecological standpoint, to really bring this deep form of healing to the way that our communities relate to land and each other.
And so how can we show up with more compassion? And when I say we, I mean we as a global community, as the human race. How can we show up with more compassion to learn from these teachings and stories?
Yeah, I find myself thinking a lot about what do I tolerate? And I think especially when you don't know things about where your food comes from, for example, it's easier to tolerate things that when faced with them directly, you might find really abhorrent and unethical. And so being curious about the process by which food gets to our plate, how it's raised, who is raising it, how does it then move from there to some place where we might access it, who's working in those places where we access it. Being curious then maybe allows you to see, to kind of pull the veil off of this, global food system that sort of delivers incredible convenience to those of us who can afford it, and to see the people and the places and the organisms and the land behind all of that, and then maybe to feel more agency in making choices about the kind of food system we want. And so, thinking about are all the workers along this path being compensated adequately and treated in the way that I would want to be treated if I were that worker? Are all the places that are raising this food being honored? Are the foods that are being grown in particular places, are those the kind of plants that those places sort of want growing there? So like I think about lettuce growing in the middle of the Arizona desert, because that makes it possible for a consumer, anywhere in the United States to eat lettuce year round. Would I maybe prefer not to eat lettuce in the middle of the winter, so that that desert doesn't have to be so kind of violently restructured, and all that water, moved around from places where ecosystems need it? So I think with that curiosity, there's an opportunity to then see all of these people and places and animals and plants in our food system more as relatives, as all of these indigenous systems teach, and to treat them the way that we would treat a friend, rather than when you don't see those processes, it's easier to kind of condone and tolerate the violence and the exploitation.
Mm, that's really powerful. It really creates a pause for people in terms of it really broadens the scope and understanding of buying local, or buying mindfully, or buying clean food. Like, what does that really mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this book has pushed me to think a lot more about um, food systems that are in the model of the natural ecosystem and whatever that place is. And so like a buffalo bison food system on the Great Plains is very much this integration with the life of the prairie, rather than a clearing of the land and then replacement with other kinds of plants that people wanted to cultivate. It's this really beautiful synergy between the food system and the ecosystem. And similarly, thinking about a woodland ecosystem on the East Coast, and Olivia Watkins raising these mushrooms in the understory of these trees, and agroforestry systems in general in places that have tree cover. It really pushes me to think beyond sort of, is the food raised organically, and more about, is this really a food system that's built into the fabric of a place?
Hmm. And what do you think we most have to learn from Healing Grounds, and from the work and research that you've been doing, connecting us with indigenous and practices that are thousands of years old?
I think the first thing, and maybe it's just really like 101, but that's where I was at the beginning of this project, is just that regenerative practices like cover cropping or minimum tillage or using more perennials, agroforestry, all of these have deep roots in indigenous communities and communities of color. And it's really important to acknowledge that these aren't brand new ideas, that these in fact are ideas that have been utilized in those contexts for a long time. And on top of that, that they have been part of resistance against an extractive agriculture, against colonialism, and that these indigenous communities and communities of color have been on the front lines of an extractive industrial agriculture for a really long time, way longer than people like me started getting concerned about the climate change impacts or the ecological impacts of that type of agriculture. And so acknowledging that, I think, is another important part of sort of giving credit where credit is due. And then in terms of moving forward, I think those acknowledgements are really helpful in understanding what the leverage points are and really moving towards a regenerative agriculture, that it is really it is a matter of social justice as much as it's a matter of trying to change the techniques that are used in agriculture. It's also a matter of shifting power, because I think the hopeful part to me is that it does seem to me that a majority of the world's people want a food system that is regenerative and reciprocal, and that whenever people have the ability to remain in a place without being disrupted by these kinds of, racist and colonial processes, they want to take care of that place. They imagine that their grandchildren will live in that place, or their nieces and nephews, or, maybe 7 generations into the future, and they want to plant a tree that those future generations will enjoy. And so it's a matter of shifting power, because if we have a democratic society, it is in fact what people want, is to have regenerative food systems and regenerative economies more broadly.
And when you say shift power, what do you mean by that?
Well, the food system is very concentrated. And so if you look at any sector of the food system, whether you look at meat packing or grain processing, or maybe the seed sector, the inputs that people use, the pesticides and the fertilizers, every single one of those sectors is basically controlled by 3 to 5 firms that have like 70% of the market share. It's an incredibly consolidated industry. And so as a result, those 3 to 5 firms in any part of the food system, and of course they collaborate, and in some cases it's the same firms in different ones of those sectors, they basically are setting policy. So instead of really having public policy or democratically informed design of the food system, what we really have is like, Cargill and Tyson Foods and ADM are like designing our food system, and not in the way that the majority of people in this world would really like to see. And of course, they're doing it based on making a short-term profit. And so that's where we have, this really highly concentrated food system with a huge imbalance of power. And then when you think about the consumer side of it, just huge gaps in people's ability to access food, let alone healthy food, let alone culturally appropriate food. And that's all deeply connected to these inadequacies, on the production side, and this deep inequality. And so that's where, moving towards policy like enforcing the antitrust policy that we have, and strengthening it, not allowing a sector that provides a basic need to be monopolized by 4 firms, but requiring that be, opened up, and that there's more competition. Some of those policies, I think, are really important in making it possible for people's voices to be heard in determining their own food system.
How do we move that needle?
Well, I mean, the good news is I think we are. So, I have been really fortunate to sort of join in this movement for food sovereignty and, what folks have called sustainable agriculture in a US global north context for a few decades, after people have already done a lot of work building these coalitions and really trying to influence federal policy in the United States, policy in the EU, UN policy. And I know from talking to older colleagues and mentors and from reading that it was really difficult to get heard in, say, the early 90s, saying stuff like we need better antitrust enforcement in the food system. That was not something that was rising to the level of kind of like national political discourse. But, in the 2020 presidential election, a number of really serious contenders for the Democratic nomination spoke about this in, very widely covered debates. And Cory Booker in particular is really stuck with this issue and continually putting bills before the Senate that would tackle antitrust, that would tackle, some of these commodity lobbies and kind of push back on some of the policies that they've had that are really friendly. And he's also tackled the idea of land justice. In the Justice for Black Farmers Act, that includes a provision that would provide land grants of, I think it's maybe up to 160 acres, I forget the final number, to Black farmers. And so I think there's movement on these issues in a way that there wasn't when these coalitions were first being built in the way that they're in their kind of like, contemporary form. So I'm hopeful that these issues are being discussed and moving forward, and that there's a real opportunity.
That's awesome. I'm hopeful too. I'm excited those pieces, because I think there is forward movement, and I feel like we are moving the needle, and it's shown that we actually need just a very small percentage to have momentum to move the needle before big changes actually experienced and seen. So that's really cool. What has surprised you the most in your research when you're doing Healing Grounds?
So many surprises. I was so humbled to realize just how deep some of these practices are that I've learned about in, a fairly recent period of time. So, for example, cover cropping. I did not realize that, George Washington Carver was working on cover cropping and composting at Tuskegee University in the very earliest part of the 1900s, and making statements similar to what you hear ecological scientists making today about essentially the difference between fertilizing and just thinking about the chemical aspect of fertility and providing fertility that includes organic matter. Like, he was calling out the difference between those two things at a time when it was really just the beginning of farmers even having access to these compounded commercial fertilizers. He was already seeing the difference between that and organic matter. And this was before we had, like the genomic science tools that we do now, where we can see the microbes that constitute the organic matter. But he could see the difference in the plant health, and he could smell the difference in the soil. And so, yeah, it's very humbling to realize that some of the insights are not new. And so it reinforces for me the idea that we really need to work on shifting power and building power, because it's not just like, well, if everybody hears this insight, we'll magically have this big transformation, because the insights have been there for quite a while. It's just that the alignment, the democracy kind of hasn't been there in the way that it needs to build the food system that the majority of people want.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Liz, I'm wondering, why is this work important to you?
That is very personal. My grandmother lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. She was born and raised on a homestead in western Nebraska. And I was lucky to know her until I was 30. We had a lot of time together before she passed, and she was a huge influence on me. I just admired her so much. She loves land. That childhood on land, I think, was so magical for her in many ways. And I loved how grounded she was. She had this wisdom that so clearly came from her deep land connection. And I really wanted that for myself. I wanted to somehow recover that life of being intimately connected to land that had been lost, in her childhood, early adulthood. And then she was also really honest with me about the Dust Bowl and what that was like, to see her family's land blow away, their livelihood blow away, their community kind of blow apart, essentially. And she knew that her dad had overplowed, that he'd gotten bad advice, from the government extension agents to do that. And she was always curious about how can we take better care of the land so that that doesn't happen again and again and again to other people. And so she really planted that seed for me of thinking about regeneration as something that must involve land. And so it's very much in memory of her and in honor of her that I'm on this journey of learning.
That's really cool. And how old were you when you first noticed that connection to the land?
I mean, some of my earliest memories, I got to see my grandparents every year. I was really lucky in that way. They didn't live in the same place we did. They ended up living in Waterloo, Iowa. I have a bunch of relatives who worked for John Deere. So they were close to agriculture. They saw, the deepening of these extractive processes, certainly all around them. So we weren't in the same place. I was in Montana, but we would see each other every year. And I mean, grandma always wanted to go out birding or go for a walk. There was something about it, like when it was cold out and other people wanted to go inside and be more comfortable, she just wanted to put on another layer and just stay outside and smell the air and hear the birds. She was just at home with land. And I just always wanted that. And I grew up hiking and, was lucky to have that connection to the outdoors. But for her, it was the fact that it had been her livelihood, the fact that she had been a steward. There was something about that and that kind of intimacy really with land that I really wanted.
And when did you realize that we needed to look to our history and to indigenous relationships with land in the regenerative space?
That's been a long process. When I first started studying organic farming, I was lucky to work for Senator John Tester, who's an organic farmer from Montana who ran for Senate in 2006 and super inspiring, won by like 3,000 votes, talking about, green economy and organic farming and renewable energy. I was lucky to go and work for him. And through him, I met kind of the organic farming community in Montana. And so I became aware at that time that there'd been this really important transition after World War II, when chemicals started being used much, much more heavily in farming because they were available, because they'd been made for World War II era munitions. And so that was kind of the story I was familiar with, was what had changed in the past half century in agriculture. But I really didn't know that much about before that. And so it was kind of, as I kept going to conferences, focused on organic and then eventually regenerative when people were using that word, and food sovereignty and food justice and community food security. And I started hearing people talking more about the history that even preceded that World War II era kind of infusion of chemicals. Like, why was our agricultural system already primed to be so flooded with chemicals? Well, it was already extractive. And why was that? Well, indigenous people had been pushed off the land. There had been, this horrific era of slavery, followed by Jim Crow and sharecropping. And all of that was really the kind of root cause of why we have this extractive logic. And then chemicals just kind of conveniently fit into that and, doubled down on it. And it really was oftentimes people of color at these conferences having to take huge risks, oftentimes being the only person of color in the room, to say, hey, regeneration looks a little different from my perspective when I think about what's broken and what needs to be fixed. The stories in my family are different. You have your Dust Bowl story, but my family has a story about slavery and sharecropping and Black land loss. And that's what I think needs to be fixed, And so it was really a long process for me of it sinking in. I don't have the whole story here. I'm looking, at the kind of tip of the iceberg, but there's so much below this that has actually created the situation that I'm now living in. And so if I really want to fix the problems that I'm experiencing, I need to understand this deeper history and really ally with folks so that we can come up with a deep fix that's really at the scale and the scope of the problem.
Wow, that's really powerful. It's almost like identifying the threads that actually weave the quilt together.
Yes. Yes, that's well said.
Yeah, it's really powerful. So how can we be more reciprocal, both of the land and with each other?
I think that's a really particular process for each person in each place, depending on how you're situated. Behind me on this bookshelf is Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I come back to again and again and share with my students. This year, I'm going to share excerpts from the audio for the first time because I feel like her voice is such a big part of her teachings. But kind of again and again, she talks about building a relationship with a place and investing in a long-term relationship with a place and all of the elements of that place, the other people, the first peoples of that place, the people who are in that place now, the soil. If you have a garden, it's just magical to cover crop and compost every year and then see the difference in that soil, 6 or 7 or 8 years down the road. If you are in a place that used to have more perennial plants and there's not very many of those, the experience of planting some perennials and just the experience of getting to know that place, which I think is necessary for care. And for a lot of us, I think in this day and age, that's a little bit of a long process. We might have been, certainly for myself, I feel like I've been disconnected from a lineage of knowing place in that intimate way that I saw, a little glimpse of in my grandmother and wanted so much. So I think curiosity and care are just very closely related to each other. And the better we get to know the places where we are, the better able we are to think about how to build our lives in ways that meet the needs of the beings around us as well as ourselves.
Wow. Relationships, curiosity, and care. It's beautiful. Liz, what's something that you always wish people asked you about that you never get to share very often, or maybe even ever, that you really, really want people to know?
That's a great question. I guess I'm very privileged because I'm realizing there's not very much coming up for me. So I think because I'm a teacher, I get asked just like every question imaginable, and I get to explore, I guess, the fullness of my being as a result.
That's awesome. And what about, let me ask you this in a different way then. What's something that you really, really wanted to include in Healing Grounds, and you just weren't able to, whether it was for the word count or um, whatever that reason was? What's something that if you could have included, you would have included?
Yeah, well, this is very specific to the stories that I had the privilege to come into a relationship with. And so it's not a comprehensive story of all of the incredible ancestral regenerative traditions that are here on this earth. So, for example, there's nothing in this book about traditional Hawaiian regenerative agriculture, which is just phenomenal. And the movement in Hawaii for food sovereignty and recovery of ancestral farming and foodways, which also include, stewardship of marine systems, is incredibly inspiring and definitely something you all should read about and check out. There's great work in sort of every genre, on YouTube and podcasts and articles about that work. And also, other Pacific islands are not in this book. And, there's just incredible, incredible regenerative traditions in that part of the world. There's very little about South Asia. It kind of comes up briefly in the context of everything that Sir Albert Howard learned. But, there's an amazing organic and regenerative farming movement in India that is really tapping into these deep roots of those farming systems that have existed for generations and generations. So what I always tell students is, explore the stories in your own communities and your own family background. And there's a lot that's not in here that might be stories that are yours to tell. And I think these stories are really important to share and to hold and to be proud of. Because I think it's one of the best parts of who we are as human beings, is these longstanding traditions of reciprocal care of Earth as the way that we feed ourselves and our communities.
What do you see coming up again and again and again in the stories that you hear and in the, I guess, in the work that you're studying?
I think that what's remarkable to me, and one of the reasons that I love this work, is the deep connection between soil and land and spirit, and how quickly a lot of people move from one to the other. And that you can be teaching a workshop on how to cover crop or how to compost, and it can be very practical, and yet you're moved to think about, what does this mean that I am literally giving back to the earth? And it becomes a metaphor for life. I think that happens for me a lot, whether it's working on this book or in my teaching or in conversations with my colleagues, that there's this movement back and forth between our technical understanding of how to grow things in a way that's ecologically sound, and just the profound principles that come from exploring that question, that have to do with how to live well, or how to live in a way that feels fulfilling and whole.
And what excites you the most and gives you really the most hope in the regenerative farming, gardening, and living space?
Definitely the people. And something that was really amazing to me in working on this book, I've generally interviewed my elders when I work on book projects. And this is the first time where I interviewed a group of people who are all younger than I am. So it's all of these women who are the next generation of leaders. And that's what's really exciting to me. There are so many people out there, and they're not all young people, but it does feel like there's this generation rising. And And not only are they doing incredible work for the land, but they're finding a lot of meaning in it. They're finding identity in it. They're finding community in it. They're finding a lot of answers to deep questions about what they want in their lives and their place in the world. And so that gives me a tremendous amount of hope.
That's awesome. And what do you most want people who pick up healing grounds to have a deeper understanding of?
Yeah. Well, I hope that it truly feels healing. I chose that word on purpose because I think that is something I've definitely found myself yearning for in doing climate work and doing justice work. And sometimes it feels like I can see problems, but I'm not sure how to move towards healing. And so that's why this book is so kind of story forward with these women who are doing it, and whose lives and projects are creating that experience of healing today. They're moving towards the future that we need, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years from now, but they're also creating it now in terms of people coming together, doing this work to repair land, finding community in that, and finding a place in the world that feels good and feels meaningful. And so I hope that's what people experience, is that as we move towards, responding to climate change, which is a long project, responding to racial injustice, which is a long project, we can also experience some of that healing today in our own bodies, in our own lives, in our own communities. By moving in that direction, we're making ourselves whole, even now, even as we still have all of these ecological and social crises that we're up against.
Yeah, Liz, I have to say that one of the pieces that I appreciated most about Healing Grounds is how it just softened my heart. It softened my heart in the way you've shared the stories of these incredible women and the curiosity that you brought to the table and you continue to bring to the table with the questions you ask. And there's no making something or someone wrong. It's more like, where are we today? And how can we bridge conversations? How can we bridge learning? How can we come together and learn together and really stand in unity, because we all actually are moving towards and wanting the same thing. And that was really powerful for me.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So where can we find your book? Where can everyone go to find your book?
I always love to encourage people to go to their favorite local independent bookstore. Those are always awesome people. I have many such people in the places I call home. So if you're in Santa Barbara, go to Chaucer's. If you're in Missoula, Montana, go to Fact and Fiction or Shakespeare and Company. That's my hometown. If you don't have a local independent bookstore, there's a really cool collaboration of local independents all over the world, I think, called bookshop.org. So if you're buying on the web, that's always the one I recommend. But it's everywhere. And it's also an audiobook. I got to read the audiobook. So if you like audiobooks, it's on whatever your platform is as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that you got to do that because you've got a great voice.
Thank you. I felt like voice is so important in this book, and I thought a lot about voice and perspective. And so I felt like I really need to kind of own this story, not in the sense that it belongs to me, but in the sense that, I need to stand in this story and speak every word. It's part of, I think, committing to it in a way, and yeah, speaking it from my heart. So I was delighted to get to read the audiobook.
That's awesome. And is there anything else you'd like to leave us with? Something that like action steps that we can do as farmers and gardeners to be more mindful and reflective and curious in the way that we grow food?
Yeah, I think just the principle of doing it in community, of the widening circles. And yes, we can have these magical experiences, maybe in our own backyards, but letting that be a portal to connecting to other people and understanding their connection to land. And so thinking of this as a collective endeavor.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Liz. I deeply appreciate you and your work. And I love your newest book because you have a few books out. What are your other ones called?
My first book is called Lentil Underground.
Yeah.
Second, I co-authored with Bob Quinn, and that's Grain by Grain. And this one is Healing Grounds.
Yeah, and they're all fabulous. So you can find them all online. And again, thank you so much. Big love.
Thank you, Natalie. Have a great afternoon.
Bye. Thank you so much for joining us. Pick up your very own copy of Healing Grounds to learn more about the powerful movement happening in farming today and the deep roots of regenerative farming. You make yourself an amazing day. Big love, and thanks again for joining us, liking the videos, sharing them with your friends, and subscribing. We appreciate you.